the mind is an embarrassment to science because it is something subjective. And of course, subjective phenomena, we try as much as possible in science to exclude them. Dress it up however you like. You can only ever observe your own mind. It is truly subjective. What the behaviorists did in the previous century was to exclude subjective phenomena from psychology, from the science of the mind. And they focused only on what is externally objectively observable, namely, of course, behavior. A different approach was taken by this chap, Sigmund Freud. His approach was that science must, the methods of science must be adjusted to its objects, not the other way around. You can't say we don't want to study subjective phenomena. If subjective phenomena exist, if mental experience is part of nature, then we have to find some way of including them within science. We can't say we're not going to study those things. And so what he did was to develop a method of interrogating mental experience, which necessarily meant that it was a highly questionable method because he was investigating subjective things using, therefore, inherently, necessarily subjective methods. And he started his first really systematic study was a study of dreams. And dreams are perhaps, quintessentially subjective because you can't say, I'm busy having this dream, can you see what I see? I mean, I'm experiencing such and such, are you too? And so on. Dreams happen while you're asleep. And you can't report on them. You can only report on them when you wake up. So they're retrospective, single witness descriptions of something that happened while you're asleep. So it really has, all three strokes against it. What Freud did, using the kind of method that I was mentioning earlier, was to get his research participants, who were mainly his patients, to take each element of the dream as they remembered it and say everything that came into their heads in connection with that image. This was the famous or infamous free association method. And Freud said, if you do that, what you find is that the associations aren't random. They all sort of point to a underlying meaning that although the dream on the surface seems chaotic and nonsensical, the associations lead you to a latent meaning, what we would nowadays call an implicit content. Freud called it latent content. So the explicit dream, what Freud called the manifest dream, is chaotic and random and apparently meaningless. But Freud said, if you follow this method of his, you find a latent, implicit content. And this content is of a stereotyped kind. It is in the nature of a wish, a heartfelt wish, a wish so heartfelt, revealing desires and inclinations of a kind that you normally wouldn't want to admit to during waking life. And on the basis of this questionable method and surprising claim, Freud built the whole of psychoanalysis. In his book on dreams, which was published in 1900, he made this little diagram, and this became the basis for his whole theory of the mind. Freud said that normally we perceive things during waking life, we lay them down in memory, and eventually in unconscious or implicit memories. And then we draw upon these to have our rational plans, goals, strategies, thoughts, which we then act on. This was his sort of picture of the mind. And on the basis of what he claims to have observed using his free association method in studying dreams, he said, well, if this is how dreams work, then the mind must be structured something like this, something like what I have on the screen. And then he said, because it appears during sleep, this part of the mind, what he called the preconscious, the rational, verbally encoded thought processes, which lead to our goal-directed actions, this goes to sleep, more or less. It doesn't go to sleep completely, as any parent of a little baby knows. There's a little kind of antenna that stays awake, but for the most part, this rational thinking, goal-directed part of the mind goes to sleep. And Freud said what that does is it releases from inhibition these heartfelt wishes and desires that I mentioned earlier, which are normally unconscious. That's what this little UCS stands for. And so these unconscious, disreputable desires press for action, press for discharge in motor activity. And so for that reason, says Freud, this is blocked. Motor activity is blocked during sleep, so that we cannot act on these, what he called repressed desires. Because why? That would wake us up. This is a very important point. He says it would wake us up if we acted on these desires. So instead, the mental activity that occurs during sleep, the activation or the release from restraint of these unconscious wishes and wants, they progress in a regressive direction, in a retrogressive direction, back onto the perceptual systems. And so we have an hallucination. We imagine ourselves doing things rather than actually doing things. So the function of dreams, says Freud, is to protect sleep. In order to not have to actually act on these desires, we hallucinate ourselves in the virtual reality of the dream to be fulfilling them. I'm sure I'm not alone in wondering, well, why don't my dreams work like that? I don't seem to be fulfilling all of my desires, my heartfelt secret wishes during my dreams. And Freud had an answer for this. He said, well, that's because, as I told you a minute ago, this part of the mind, the preconscious part, isn't entirely asleep. There's still a glimmer of, of a watch person there checking on what's going on. In the outside world, it might be a baby crying. In terms of the inside world, it is, oh my God, what is this thing that's happening? I seem to want to do that. Oh my word, that too might wake the sleeper up. And so it's disguised, says Freud. There's a censor that disguises and distorts these wishes, and this is why dreams look so nonsensical. They're not transparent. They're censored. Now, that's a very complicated theory. And remember, the method upon which it's based is simply having the dreamer say everything that comes into their head. On the basis of that method, Freud made these really quite bold claims. Despite the sort of shakiness of the method and therefore the shakiness of the theoretical conclusions, many people were persuaded. And the psychoanalytic movement became very powerful in the early years of the 20th century, so much so that it came to dominate world psychiatry. And in America, which those days dominated the world, psychoanalysis was absolutely de rigueur. You could not become a tenured professor at any decent American university, a professor of psychiatry, unless you were a psychoanalyst. So against this backdrop, the publication of a book called Conjecture and Refutation by the famous philosopher of science, Karl Popper, was rather a blow to psychoanalysis and to psychiatry, because Popper used this theory that I've just described to you as an example of what he called pseudoscience. It looks like science, it sounds like science, it aspires to be science, but it isn't science. And the basic point that Popper made was it does not give rise to predictions which are falsifiable. This was Popper's basic rule of how to determine whether a theory is scientific or not. If it's scientific, It must give rise to predictions which can either be confirmed or disconfirmed. And Popper said in the case of Freud's theory, you can't disconfirm it, because when you say, but this dream and this dream and this dream aren't wishful, I don't see any heartfelt desires in these, Freud would say, well, yeah, that's in the manifest dream, the explicit content, but behind that is an implicit latent content, which I interpret. And Popper made the not unreasonable point that you can always interpret every dream to reveal some hidden wish that you find as somebody might find meaning in tea leaves or in an ink blot. But that doesn't mean that it's really there. And the crucial point is you can't falsify the claim, because every dream can be made to support the theory, the hypothesis that dreams are an attempt to fulfill a heartfelt but repressed wish, and that the purpose of all of this is to protect sleep. So bearing in mind how influential psychoanalysis was in world psychiatry at that time, it was a great relief when in the early 1950s, two American physiologists named Azarinsky and Kleitman discovered what has come to be known as REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. They used a new method, a method that wasn't available in Freud's day, called the electroencephalograph, EEG. And this is a technology which you place electrodes on the scalp of the research subject, which records through the cranium the electrical activity going on in the brain, the level of electrical activity, of brain arousal. And as Azarinsky and Kleitman predicted, that if you measure the brain by this method as it goes to sleep, its level of arousal should decline as measured by the EEG. So what you see on this sort of cartoon here, this axis is the level of brain arousal from wakefulness going to lower and lower levels of brain activation. And this axis here is time. So we're looking at 8 hours of time here. And what Azarinsky and Kleitman observed was exactly what they predicted, that as you fall asleep, so your level of brain arousal declines. What was surprising, though, the wonderful thing about science is that you don't only find your Easter eggs where you had hidden them beforehand, you get surprises. The surprise was that 90 minutes later, the brain reactivates itself and then goes down back into that quiescent state and then reactivates itself, and does this in regular, roughly 90-minute cycles. So what was this all about? You know, it's a paradox, and they originally called it paradoxical sleep before it was renamed REM sleep. The paradox being, you're asleep in a state of repose and quiescence, and yet your brain becomes almost as activated as it is when you're awake. This led them to the hypothesis that perhaps this paradoxical arousal of the brain was the physiological equivalent of the psychological paradox that during the unconsciousness of sleep, you have these moments of consciousness where, despite the fact that you're asleep, you suddenly start experiencing something, and that is the dream. This paradoxical punctuation of the unconsciousness of sleep with the conscious experience of dreams, they hypothesized might be the subjective correlate of the objective phenomenon they just discovered, namely this paradoxical brain arousal.